Hi. I have always wanted to be a photographer, in particular a street photographer. The great street photographers, people like Walker Evans, Helen Levitt, Elliot Erwitt, Gary Winogrand, are people who can wander the city and they capture these amazing moments that everyone recognizes. And I often notice these moments of humor, these moments of sadness, visual poetry. I think a lot of us see these things, but I'm usually not close enough or quick enough or inconspicuous enough to capture them before they disappear. And beyond that, wandering the city is not easy when you have a busy job and 2 young children. The closest I get to free time every day is a half-hour commute on the subway. Now, I learned to ride the subway as a student at Hunter in the 1980s. For those of you too young to remember the 1980s, this is what the subway looked like then. And this was what it looked like on the inside. And for me, actually, and I suppose for many students here, Hunter, it was the first time that I took the subway without a grown-up. And on my very first day of 7th grade, our health ed teacher, Ms. Miley, talked to our class about what to do if a stranger approaches you on the subway. Now, there aren't really any written rules for how to behave on the subway, but the first thing you want to remember is not to draw attention to yourself. You want to make a little space for yourself, sort of make yourself feel alone in the crowd. And when you've made that space for yourself, you also want to pretend that other people are in their space. So you don't want to look. At least you don't want to look like you're looking. Everyone looks. So I'm riding the Q train one morning. This was a couple of years ago, and I had an iPhone, which has a camera, and I was starting to play with Instagram, and I took this picture. So you'll see there is a man reading in Hebrew on the left of the pole, and a man reading his phone in Arabic on the right of the pole. And each of these people, each of these men are in his space, so they don't notice each other, they don't notice me. Subway's crowded, and I'm standing above them looking at my phone. And it's a safer place, the subway, now than what it was when I was in high school. But taking this picture still felt like something of a risk, but I liked what it showed about the city and about strangers. So a word about strangers. A stranger, according to the sociologist George Simmel, is someone who is close in some ways and distant in others. In the subway, you're next to, sometimes touching, these people who are going your way but otherwise have nothing to do with you. And that may seem natural. I mean, if you live in the city, it just is how the city is, but it's not. And in fact, before there were trains in the 19th century, you really didn't sit next to people you didn't know for any period of time. So God only knows what Miss Miley would think, but taking this picture was a thrill. You know, I got to break the rules that I learned riding to school. And that thrill grew when I shared this picture. It got 2 likes, one from a photographer I admire, and so I became a subway photographer. So I was skittish at first. I avoided faces, but I got bolder about it. And it's amazing what you can notice when you stop pretending not to look. For example, how during flu season, some people hold the pole with a napkin. And then there are people who match the color palette of the seats, and poster tubes, I learned, make excellent chin rests. And there are a lot of ways that people make space for themselves on the subway. Every New Yorker, I'm sure all of you have your blank stare, where you focus a couple of feet in front of your face. You can also use your hands, and you can also use a book. Books, they do block your gaze, and they also bring you into another world. Magazines are good for this too, and the Bible, also good for this. A lot of people pray on the train, I notice. And I always think of prayer as something private, a private act, but as you probably know, people do a lot of things on the subway that you expect them only to do in private. For instance, putting on makeup or reading 50 Shades. So I see people eating breakfast. I see people doing their homework. I see people kissing and filling out surveys about the TEDx event they just went to. Of course, a lot of looking at your phone and playing games. And then there are headphones. Now, headphones are another great way of making space for yourself. I learned this in high school when I started to carry a Walkman. And again, a Walkman, that's like an iPod, except you put these things called cassettes in it. You ask your parents later. So anyway, when I was in my Walkman, and I thought of my Walkman as a space, as a place you would go into. It's like a safe harbor. You know, if you know little kids will cover their eyes, like a 3-year-old will cover their eyes, and she'll think that she's invisible, that nobody could see her because she's hiding. And that's kind of how headphones work for me. They can be like walls. And they also help me with my subway photography, because when I wear headphones, nobody pays much attention to what I'm doing. They think I'm in my own space. Now, I notice what other people are doing on their screens, and that means that people can see what I'm doing on mine. So I looked around and I found this app called SpyPic. And SpyPic does not look like a camera on the screen. It can look like a game. It can look like a calculator. For months, I was photographing through this article. It's a news story about the BP oil spill. And, you know, I developed my technique over time. Eventually, I went to a black screen. The second thing about SpyPic is there's no button for the shutter. You can tap anywhere on the screen. So what I would do, and imagine this is an iPhone, I would hold the phone at my chest, and I have my headphones on, and so I can photograph. It's pretty easy to hide what I'm doing. You know, I've been found out a couple of times. There was one guy who got really angry, although he didn't, it wasn't physical confrontation. There's one woman who smiled at me. She thought I was flirting. But most of the time, nobody knows what I'm doing. And so, you know, like the people with the books and like the people with their blank stares, this is the new way I make space for myself. I take photographs of strangers. Now, the subway is not an ideal environment for photography. The tunnels are dark, the lights are low, it shakes, and still, over the years, many people have tried. If you know Flickr, the photo sharing service, there's a New York City subway group with almost 9,000 members. And so there are a lot of amateurs that take subway photographs. Also professionals do it. And some do it in the open, and others are sneaky about it. In around 1950, there was a photographer named Arthur Leipzig, and he spent 3 months riding the train with a pet carrier on his lap. And inside his pet carrier was his Rolleiflex camera. And the only time he had a hard time was when people wanted to see his dog. And then there was Walker Evans, and I mentioned him earlier. Walker Evans was one of the all-time great photographers. Now, he used a 35mm camera on the subway, and he painted the chrome parts black. And he strapped it to his chest and put it under his coat. The lens was going through a buttonhole, and then he had like a cable going down to his hand. And he would sit across from his subjects on the train and wait for the train to stop, and he'd push the cable release. Now, his photographs eventually were shown at the Museum of Modern Art, and they're published in a book, Many Are Called, which was re-released recently. It's a wonderful collection. I recommend it. Anyway, once in a while, somebody will ask me, you know, isn't it illegal to take pictures on the subway? And in fact, the MTA used to ban photography, and you may remember after 9/11, that police would hassle you if you had a camera out, you know, critical infrastructure, national security. And there are laws. It is a felony if you take your camera and you look up a woman's skirt on the train, which some people do. But the simple answer to that question is no. It's not illegal to take a picture on the subway, but that's not really the point of their question. The point of their question is really, it's not a legal question they're asking, it's a moral question, an ethical one. And what they're really asking is, isn't what you are doing wrong? And it turns out that this question is as old as photography itself. So in the early days of photography, in the mid-1800s, you would have these glass plates that would be your negative, and you'd have to brush on emulsion, and it had to still be wet when you took the picture. So you needed a darkroom with you. And then you also, the exposures were so slow that you always needed a tripod. So basically photography at that point, in 1850, 1860, photography is slow and messy and cumbersome. It's a pain, and it's also obvious what you're doing. And then around 1880 came along what was called the dry plate method. And that made everything faster, and it made it easier, and it made it cheaper, more accessible. It could be your hobby. You didn't have to do all that other stuff. And because the exposure was faster, you could have handheld cameras. You could take snapshots for the first time. And so you started to see things in the 1880s like the hat detective camera. Basically what would happen is there's a slot in there where your negative goes, and then you would hold your camera in front of your chest, kind of the way I hold my iPhone when I'm using SpyPic, and take a picture. There was also C.P. Stern's concealed vest camera. Took round negatives. And there's a photo historian, a guy named Bill Jay, who chronicled the sort of worries of the public, because the public got worried about all these things. And he cited this article from the New York Times, 1884, titled "The Camera Epidemic." So it says, even when walking quietly on the public street, a person is not safe, for not only is he constantly made the victim of camera lunatics and so forth, and the language seems a little hysterical now, a little funny now, but the feeling of violation, I think, is real. So technology changed, and the rules of society had not caught up. Actually, government stepped in to protect ordinary citizens. In Paris, until 1890, it was illegal to take street photographs. A few decades later, when the 35mm camera came around, Paris would become a capital of street photography, and places like MoMA sort of turned and consecrated, the photos of Walker Evans and other street photography as art. But Evans himself had some qualms about his subway photographs. When he wrote about his subway series, he compared himself to a hunter stalking prey and called himself a penitent spy and an apologetic voyeur. He also said his impudent invasion of people's space was softened by the passage of time. Now, Evans took his pictures between 1938 and 1941. The book and the MoMA show happened in 1966, so that's basically as far since my high school graduation to today. Time can pass much faster right now, so I can take a picture on the subway. I can share it when I get to above ground or to a stop with a signal. Then someone sees it, they have a reaction, they post that, I see that, and seconds elapse. It's a very quick feedback loop, and frankly, most of the feedback is positive, and the feedback is part of what keeps me going, it urges me on, but things can get complicated. So one morning I took this picture on the F train, and there's a guy I know. I don't really know him. Actually, I know him from Twitter. He writes little stories on Twitter, and I follow him. He follows me. But anyway, he wrote a little story about what he saw in this photograph, and I'll just read the beginning. "I hate my job," she thinks. "My cat pees everywhere. My shoes suck. My bagel didn't fulfill me." I mean, he may be mocking her, and this may be a curious form of empathy, but in either case, I think he finds something recognizable in the urban condition. He feels something when he sees this, and that made me feel I'd made a successful photograph, because that's what a great street photograph does for me. It makes me empathize or understand or think about a stranger. Another friend weighed in, and he said, "So I know this person. She's a former coworker. Sort of strange to see her pop up in your feed." And so moments like this keep happening. If you remember this guy reading Bruno Schultz, it turns out we have friends in common, and they let him know, and this became his Facebook profile picture for a while. Now, he did not ask my permission, but under the circumstances, I'm not going to complain. And then another time, I took a picture of a little girl I saw looking out the window on the platform at Church Street. And I got on the train, and I realized I knew her, and I knew her mother. And so I sent them the picture, and the picture ended up on Facebook. So subway photography, and really street photography in general, has always been about encounters with strangers. And the subjects of those photographs generally remain strangers. I mean, how many of the people Walker Evans photographed came into MoMA 25 years later and like, oh, that's me? But among the strangers I photograph, I keep coming across, and you'll know this term, people you may know. Now, you look at people you may know differently than you look at strangers, and technology is getting better at turning strangers into people you may know. It begins with the social networks, but there's facial recognition software, and wireless is coming to the subways, and cameras everywhere. So you can argue we're maybe living through another camera epidemic. This time the government may be on a different side. But I'm more interested in, how we look at each other and what kind of city you live in when the subway is full of people you may know, and how you can make space for yourself. What does Miss Miley tell her students about how to ride the subway? How have the rules changed? And that's not something I think we know, but we know that technology changes how we live. The camera did, the subway did, and now mobile phones. And there are people who think that mobile phones, they sap the joy out of life, and they make us disconnected. But I also see moments when they make us happy, and they give us a voice, and they bring us together. Mostly, however, I notice when someone catches the light in his hand, and when the light reflects back from your phone onto your face and sort of makes this blue glow. I also love when people share earbuds. It's like an umbilical cord between them. And then, of course, there are things that technology doesn't change. People are always looking. And though we try not to get caught, everyone looks, including you and me. Thank you very much.